Welcome to my YouTube channel, Rick Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the link in the lower right hand corner to subscribe to my channel. This is the narrated tutorial for my painting, Country Rainbow. Before I begin, I'll review the colors used in this painting. Quinacridone Gold, Sap Green, Quinacridone Coral, Alizarin Crimson Quinacridone, Quinacridone Violet, Mauve, Royal Blue, and Ultramarine Blue. I've drawn a light sketch with a B pencil on a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold press Lanaquarel watercolor paper. I'm not using any reference photo for this painting. Instead, this is a template from an exercise that I use in some of my workshops. It's actually an exercise with limited palette. However, I'm going to take this sketch and I'm going to make it very chromatic for this video. So I've drawn the sketch and I won't be using any reference. I'm just going to be painting this as I go. So I've started to wet the paper with a 1-inch flat brush. I'm just using clear water, and I'll be starting working wet and wet. However, I'm being selective on where I wet the paper, so that way I have control over where this very loose wash is going to go. While you can't see it on the camera, because I'm using clear water, I'm cutting around areas, shapes where I want to preserve the pure white of the paper. So this will be a very loose chromatic wash with a lot of color, but it's going to be controlled because I'm protecting some of the shapes in this composition. And in this instance, I'm not using any masking or frisket. Some of my paintings I do. It depends on the subject and the technique or the result I'm trying to get. In this case, I'm just cutting around the areas that I want to preserve the white. That way, when I start to put the paint in onto the wet paper, the paint's only going to flow in the areas where I've wet the paper, and the dry area will resist the flow of the paint. I want the paint to flow into the lower half of the composition, although it's going to be very light, so I'm going to wet the bottom half here with water. So this area that I've applied the water on is going to be saturated, so I'll be working on saturated paper when I first apply my wash, so working, like I said, wet into wet. And I want my paper to be saturated. I don't want it to be damp. And the best way to determine that is to look for a glossy finish on the paper. So if it's saturated, it's going to be glossy. When it starts to get more of a satin sheen, it's becoming damp, and there's a difference in working in the two conditions of paper. I'm going to start to apply my wash using a large round wash brush, and I'm going to start with some warm colors here. So I'm going to be using some quinacridone gold with a little quinacridone coral mixed in. It's almost an orange color, and I'll be letting a lot of this paint mix on the paper. One of the things I have to be careful of is some of these combinations that I'll be working with are on opposite sides of the color wheel and can quickly turn into neutral tones, gray tones that it's not really what I'm after. I want this to stay very chromatic, so I have to be aware of the placement of some of these colors that I'm putting down in relationship to other colors. And one of the things that helps being able to put some of these colors near each other is being aware where the paint's going to flow. I know I'm working at a 20-degree angle, so gravity is going to pull my paint downward, and by positioning colors side by side in a manner that the gravity is going to pull them down but not into each other, I can create a variegated wash where I don't get that mingling so much on the paper. The edges will merge, but they won't really mix, and it's not going to neutralize the color too much. But there'll be a little of that. I just have to, something you have to be aware of. You can see that I've got some orange tones above the building, and I have some blue there. And those two, when they mix together, could definitely cause a gray. So it's a combination of the technique I'm using and the placement. So I've tried not to put that blue transitioning right into the orange flowing down the page. It's flowing it more oranges into a green. And now I'm going from a blue into a violet. So those colors are close on the color wheel, and they're going to stay fresh and chromatic as opposed to turning into a gray. Now my paper, like I said, it's saturated, and as I add more paint, I continue to saturate the paper. So I can go back in and add more paint. And if I had waited till my paper was more of a damp condition, then I start risking getting backwashes and blossoms. But with my paper being saturated, I'm not going to get any backwashes. That paint's just going to diffuse and flow into what I have on the paper. Here I'm using a 5 ml spray bottle, and I'm going to soften some edges where it's starting to get a little hard there, and I'm going to spray to help diffuse the color and lighten the color a little bit in that lower half. Here I'm going to go back in, strengthen some of these colors, and this is where I do have to be careful because I've got a couple colors there, that red and that green, to give me too strong a neutral, but it's not too bad. So you can see the white shapes that I cut the clear water around when I was applying it. If you look at the area above the roof on the large building, you can see there's a large bead of pigment that's built up there. The water has flowed down because of the angle I'm working at. And much more water collecting there could break that bead, and it would trickle down the page. Or if I increase the angle of my board, it can make that bead break. So I'm going to pick that up before it does. That's one of the things you have to be aware of when you're working in this technique, where you're doing a big wash, have a lot of water, but you have areas you want to protect. You have to watch where where the moisture gathers, and just take your brush and remove it. The other thing that could happen if I let it sit there too long is it would start to backwash. As the paper above it started to dry, it would wick that moisture up in to it and cause it to backwash and cause blossoms. You can see I've taken my spray bottle and I've lightened and softened what's going on in the lower half and diffused that color down. Now I'm going to start to work with some darker values. My paper has been thoroughly dry, so now I'm working wet on wet. And I'm using a smaller brush than I might use for this area because I'm going to have a lot of color changes. So I'm going to put down smaller amounts of paint so that I can accomplish more changes of color in the small area. If I were to take a big flat brush, which I might do sometimes, or I might paint this with a 1/2-inch flat brush normally, and still have color changes, but with this painting I'm doing a lot of quick color changes, so I'm putting down smaller amounts of paint so that I can accomplish several changes within a small area. And I use that initial wash as my color roadmap. So I'm picking up on the colors that were put down earlier and going with darker values. And I'll change it a little bit here and there. But as I put this wash down, this is one wash, but I'm changing the colors. And I'm trying not to let the edge of the wash dry as I bring that down, because I don't want to set any hard edges there. As I said, I'm not using any reference for this, any photo reference. I'm being guided by light source. I have a light source coming from the right. So I'm putting my darker values on what would be the shadowed side of this building and the other objects, the other elements of the composition. There's an area that I've painted in there that indicates a shadow being cast on the sunlit side of this building. So I'm coming in with a darker value on that shadow. And so far, the colors that I've used, right now I'm working with some alizarin and some quinacridone violet. And to the left, I've been using same colors I used in my initial wash: quinacridone gold, sap green, ultramarine blue, mauve. So I'm using colors that are around the color wheel. Now I'm going to soften the edge of this with clear water, and I'm going to gradate that value down. I'm going to use the spray to soften that. I'm trying to paint this in a manner that I'm softening those edges as they move down the page and they start to gradate to a lighter value to create a vignetted painting. Now I'm going to bring in a darker value here off the edge of this smaller building. So a lot of this has to do with edge development, which starts to define the shapes. And I have hard edges, I have soft edges. And there's some subtle areas where you get some lost and found edges. Here you can see, just as I did on the side of that building, I'm working a lot of colors into a small area, a lot of color changes. And I try to always be aware of what colors I'm putting beside one another and how I'm going to have to treat those if I'm going to keep these colors vibrant. Along with this edge development, a lot of what I'm doing is working in negative space off what I refer to as negative edges. And too often I think people refer to negative painting as painting the background. And when two shapes come together, you start to get a positive and negative relationship. The overlapping shape is positive, and the shape that's underlying that has a negative edge. So they share an edge, and one is positive, one is negative. In the case of this small building, I'm painting off the negative edge there, which starts to define the shape of the building. But it's not the background. There's shapes that are overlaying one another, and when those come together, they create positive negative relationships. So it's not always background when you're working in negative space. Sometimes those words are used interchangeably as negative space and background. And there's negative space anywhere two shapes come together and overlap one another. For instance, if you look at the small building there, the roof line, it's being defined, that shape of the roof is beginning to get defined by the tree shape that I've painted, by the shadow to the left of the roof where I've painted that shadow that's being cast on the large barn. That's off the negative edge of that roof line, but it's not background. It's the side of that, it's the front of that building. But because it's being overlapped by the roof, it starts to create that positive negative relationship, and I can define that roof by painting that shadow. The shapes that are starting to develop to this point are developing because of the brushwork, the washes I've done off the negative edges of those shapes. I want more intensity in this sky and a little bit darker value. So I've turned my painting upside down, And now I'm going to apply a wash over this area, and because my board's at an incline here, the paint's going to flow away from the edges of the buildings and the areas in the foreground there, and I'm going to be able to help maintain a clean edge and get the gradation going away from that a little bit. And I'm going to change these colors quite a bit as I put this down. So this is a mixture of quinacridone gold, quinacridone coral, a little alizarin. And because I'm not being guided by a reference photo, I'm not trying to reproduce something I'm seeing in a photo. I can be very creative with my colors and just have a little bit of fun with it. And here I've got a little alizarin crimson with a touch of mauve mixed in. I'm going to bring in a strong or an intense green, sap green. So I need to be careful here because you have this green and red. They can quickly turn to a gray, which I don't want. So I'm going to put a little gold in there, a little quinacridone gold, to help that transition a little bit and keep it from leaning too neutral. So I've put that gold in between the strong red and the green to help keep some of the intensity and avoid getting too much of an earthy tone or a strong gray neutral in that area. Once I've started working wet on dry, my paper gets saturated and I transition to working wet on wet. And you want to be sure when that water builds up at the bottom of your paper on the edges that you try to keep that picked up, or it's going to get somewhere that you don't want it, especially if you use a hairdryer. It's going to blow it around and get in places you don't want. Now I'm going to dry this and I'll turn it right side up. I begin to put some cool tones on these silos here behind the building, working with ultramarine blue and using a little quinacridone violet. Now I'm going to do some brushwork, do some kind of colorographic marks on the side of this building. And I'm pretty much going to follow the colors that are in the general area, and I'm working with darker values. So my paper's thoroughly dry. I'm working wet on dry. And I've approached this by starting with a loose wet and wet wash. Then I did a little bit of brushwork on some damp paper, but a lot of what I'm doing now, this small shape making and colorographic marks and line, are all being done working wet on dry. I'm going to move around the composition and do some of this brushwork, and as I do this, as I put some of these darker values down, I'm doing it with respect to where my light source is. A lot of times when I'm painting in some of these areas, I'll put down a wash, and then I'll come back and touch it with some color to charge it with another color, and so it's not always just a flat wash. Sometimes it's a flat one-tone wash, but a lot of times I mix the colors, as you've seen throughout here. While I'm doing a wash, I'll integrate multiple colors. Sometimes I do that as I'm doing the wash. Other times I'll come back after I cover the area and the paper's wet, and I'll touch it with a color just to put a little bit of an accent and just charge the wash. Brush I'm using right now is a quill brush that I like to use. You've seen probably in a lot of my videos if you've watched them. And it does a nice job, holds quite a bit of paint, keeps a nice point. It can do some of the work of a small brush without being small. And depending on the angle and the way you hold it and the speed you use it, you can get some expressive brush strokes, or you can get some textures with it. You can do a variety of types of line with it. I'm going to start to define the edge of this roof line, and I like to use line and little marks, little dots and dashes to help define edges like this. So I don't want to just outline something. I'm going to start it and I'm going to stop, pick it up, so it becomes a lost and found line almost, or an edge. So I like to break that up. It keeps it much more interesting than if I were just to draw straight lines around everything and like I said, outline it. And here you can see I can change the angle of my brush as I move it from side to side, and I can change the width of that line by changing the angle of my brush. When I make a mark with one brush stroke, it's going to be much more expressive than if I'm painting it and filling it in. When you can just make a one-off brush mark that makes a statement, it's more expressive than just drawing it and trying to fill it in with the tip of a brush. And there's just a noticeable difference in freshness with those one-off brush strokes that you can make. As I paint some of these shapes, I'm changing colors. A lot of them are to the color that is originally in my wash or some of the other painting that I've done. But some of them are just to extend some of the colors across the composition to help create a balance. When I put that initial wash down, it helps unify the whole composition because it just flows throughout the whole painting. But as I start to develop this and paint these shapes, I want to bring those accents into different areas. Right here I've put some dark red-violet tones down, but I've also put some gold and some kind of a red-orange tones also in those window shapes. So that helps pull some of those colors from the sky and brings it across the composition. And it's not a reference photo that's telling me that. It's just trying to make an interesting design and follow the elements and the principles of design. I want to have repetition. I want to have unity. I want to have balance and harmony. I've got a lot of gradation going on throughout that. So those are some of the things that you want to try and achieve as you're developing your painting. I'm going to paint what's the shadowed side of this back building, and I want to bring some of these warmer tones into this area a little and some larger shapes. So I'm going to do that on this area of the building. And we bring some touches around the side there. A lot of times if I make a mark and I don't like it, I'll touch it with a tissue and blot it to remove it, or if it's looks too forced, sometimes I'll just touch it with a tissue just to break it up a little bit. It'll give a little texture, a little pattern in it, and make it more interesting. It's not so forced. And as I paint this area, I'm not necessarily happy with the way it's going. That orange is standing out a little too much for me, and I'm trying to pull that from the sky. But that sky is also I like that orange, but it's a little bit much perhaps. It really starts to draw you into that, so I might tone that down. And here you can see that I'm blotting this with a tissue. Not real happy with the result I had there. I want to see a little more of that edge showing. So I'm going to leave that alone before I just get too fussy with it. I'm going to move on to some of these other areas. I'm going to do some more brushwork here on the side of this building. I'm using some indigo blue for these dark values. So this is a much different way than painting when you compare it to working with a reference photo and trying to reproduce what you're seeing in your photograph. This is just having a little bit of fun with color, value, shapes. And another way to approach this would be to just start with a drawing and do some value sketches. Again, no reference, but do a variety of value sketches to look at some different options. You could do exactly what I'm doing here using a limited palette, but I've chosen to do take a very chromatic approach to this and work with color intensity. I want to bring a little bit of that green into this area, that green and the gold. So not too strong, but again, I want to distribute some of that color and pull it into this area of the painting. So there's just a touch of that green. I'm going to continue my brushwork, and I'm getting darker with values, using different colors, using a lot of line. I think that's something that often gets overlooked. As I continue to develop this, I'm going to do a lot of brushwork here, creating line and little calligraphic marks. And I think that really starts to bring a painting to life. Again, I'm not outlining. I'm just trying to, right now, add some darker value shapes and line to help make this pop a little bit more. And again, I'm not looking at pictures of the barn right now that are telling me to paint these. I'm putting value where I feel it needs value and color where I feel it needs color. And I always tell people, if you don't know why you're putting your brush to the paper, you shouldn't be putting it there. If you're putting it there and putting something down, there should be a reason. It shouldn't just be because you feel you're not done and you just keep painting. And I've said that before in my videos. I'm going to add a few more darker accents. Another reason sometimes I'll make some of these marks is to help further define an edge. You can define edges by using marks and line, small shapes. They don't have to be big washes to define edge. When you bring a line up to an object and stop and then pick it up on the other side of that object, you've helped define that edge with that start and stop and that interruption in that line. You know there's something there, even if that area has been painted or not. It helps define that edge, and you can use line in that manner. I want to pull some of those colors down a little bit and just create an irregular shape to the bottom edge of this kind of vignetted composition. So I put some clear water down and drop in some color in that. and let that kind of run down vertically, and then I'm going to soften that with a fine mist spray. So that helps pull some of the color down and makes that shape, that bottom half, a little bit more interesting. The orange tone in my painting has been bothering me because it feels too strong. And I'm going to tone some of that down by glazing over it with an alizarin crimson. So that tones that down a little bit, cools it down a little. And I'm going to do the same with the sky there on the left. That orange is just a little too strong for me. I don't like the shape of that area. I've turned my board upside down, and I'm going to glaze over this area with this that has this strong orange. I'm going to glaze over it with a thin wash of alizarin crimson. So I'm using a soft brush here because I really don't want to agitate the paint there too much. It's just one of my normal wash brushes, but this round wash brush is very soft. You can definitely glaze over painted areas, and you often do. But when you're doing a large area like this over an area that's already been painted, you just need to be careful, or you can start to get some unwanted effects to the underlying paint that's been put down. Use this spray because it does a nice job softening and diffusing without agitating the paint. If I get too close with a spray and too strong, it will agitate it some. I'm going to pick up some of the excess moisture. I need to soften that left side a little bit. And now I'm going to dry it. I'm going to put a white mat on this to get a good look at it. And there you have my painting, Country Rainbow. I hope you can see in that top left that overpowering orange that was there has been toned down by that glaze, and now the attention is more where it needs to be in the painting. So this is just a fun way to paint. You're not trapped by trying to copy a photograph. You can be creative and have a little bit of fun and a little experiment with it. And you can take the same approach to florals, cityscapes, still lifes, portraiture, just about anything. Thanks for watching. I hope you have fun with this. If you want to subscribe or see any of my other videos, you can click any of the boxes that are appearing on the screen.